recording here. There we go. So, and what I'll do now is I will highlight me. So spotlight me so you can see what's going on. So today we're talking about Chironomids, which are basically midges. And after the eggs are laid in the bottom of the lake or stream, they go through four different stages, I guess. They start off as a worm. So that's the first stage we're going to talk about. I'm going to go through the most common stages. The next stage is the pupa, which is this guy here. And that one exists at the bottom or near the bottom of the lakes until it comes time for the insect to hatch. And when they hatch, they come up and you get what we call an emerger, which is this guy, where the insect crawls out of its nymphal shuck and turns into an adult. And then the last one is the midge itself, the adult fly, which typically is not available to the fish because they don't stay around on the surface of the water or in the water. So we're going to talk about the ones that are available to fish. So we're going to talk about the first one, which is the worm, and everybody's heard of the bloodworm. And that's what this guy is. Now, one of the things you've got to remember when you're tying these things is if you see an adult midge, the things that you swat when they come around your face, the actual worm, the larva, is about 4 times the size of the midge, the actual adult. So, and in Alberta, there's some lakes where the midges are the worms are 3 inches long. And over the course of the instars during the season, they tend to get a little shorter. I don't think that happens as much around here. I think most of the ones we get in this kind of size range. So that's the larval stage. Now, I use these guys here. This is a curved hook that's made by Mustad. I call it a worm hook. I don't know the actual number. But it has a really nice arched curve to it. And this is such a simple fly to tie. What I'm going to do is with it is I'm going to use red thread because the worms are typically a reddish or red or reddish brown color. We'll start right behind the eye of the hook. And I like covering the hook shank with the red thread just to cover up the metal so it doesn't glint. And it gives me a starting place here. So this is going to take very short time to make this fly. And I wrap the thread all the way down the hook shank, trying to cover up the hook shank a little bit. And I'll take it right down to the bend. I've debarbed this hook already, by the way. Now, what I'm going to use for this, you can use a variety of materials. I'm using this stuff called ultra chenille. And the difference between ultra chenille and the regular chenille is the ultra chenille has not got that core of like string that is twisted to hold the material in. This stuff has the material fused to some kind of core. And as a result, it doesn't come apart like a typical chenille would come apart. It's just all bound together to the core. So it's all one piece. And I'm going to pick something that in terms of length of the ultra chenille I'm going to use. I pick at least 2 shank lengths of material. And I'll trim that off of the bunch. And I'll set it down on the hook so that about an equal amount projects beyond the front and the back of the hook. Tie it at the back first. Just a couple of good wraps around in one spot. I lift it up, wrap the thread up to the midpoint of that curve, hold the material down on the curve, do a couple of wraps there, lift it up, come around just behind the eye, go down here and wrap a couple more wraps, and then we finish the hook. So if you want to tie a whole whack of these, it doesn't take very long. And again, I won't bother using glue on this. I'm just going to use 2 wraps, 2 whip finishes. And there you have it. That is the basic bloodworm. It didn't take long at all. Now, you can gussy it up a little bit, make it a little fancier. Instead of just tying it down in the middle, you can actually wrap the ultra chenille around the center part of the hook, and that gives a little more robust body if you want to tie something that's a little bigger. Or you can get really fancy. And this one I used floss, and I made the curved body of the floss with red floss, and then over wrapped it with epoxy. That just makes a smaller worm, but it's another way of doing a bloodworm. So they're fairly straightforward to do.
Well, Dave, are they bent in nature? Are they curved?
They when they're swimming around on the bottom, they do like a worm do. They kind of bunch up and stretch out, bunch up and stretch out. And I think that's why the curved stuff works, because their behavior is they kind of swim along.
So they're better on a curved hook
bottom
than they are on a straight hook.
Yeah, I've never seen them done with a straight hook. They're always with a curved hook, and I suspect it's because of the behavior of the larva.
Dave, I've also seen them with a bead in the middle of the San Juan worm. Is there any advantage or disadvantage to that?
Weight, yes. And I would suggest you try some with not just one bead, but maybe 2 or 3 nice red beads in the middle, and tie a piece off at each end, like a piece of that chenille off each end with the beads in the middle. Because the problem with this, if you're going to fish this on a strike indicator, there's no weight to them. That's another reason for the epoxy version, right? Is there's no weight to them. And if you're fishing it under a strike indicator, and let's talk about that for a minute before I go on to the next guy, because you're going to be using both that and the next guy under a strike indicator. I'll take this out. This is my Chironomid rig. So what this consists of is, first off, if you're fishing deep and you've got a long leader, I heartily recommend these indicators that are made and marketed by Phil Rowley and Brian Chan. This is a little foam ball, and this is a probably a 10 or a 12-foot leader with a loop on the end that I tie on my butt section, and it's tapered, and it goes down to probably 4x at the tippet, because I don't need a lot of heavy section in that leader. And so you feed this guy here, the float, you feed that over the butt section, but you put this little plastic peg on from the tip section of the leader, because what you want to do is to set the depth of this thing. You figure out where you want this float on the leader, and then you just do this. You make a little loop here and shove the peg up in the hole. Now, the reason these are really good is that if you've got a 12-foot leader and you've got a 9-foot rod, trying to land a fish with a strike indicator at the rod tip and all this line out in front of you is a lot harder. You need a really long handle net. But with this style of leader, with this style of indicator, when the fish strikes, it pulls this way, and this indicator can slide all the way up to the rod tip, and it'll slide all the way down to where the bottom end is. So you can actually reel the sucker in until it's really close to you. So you don't need a long handle net to land them. Now, the downside of it is that if you have this peg stuck in here, when they sell them as a float with a peg, if you lose the peg, you're SOL.
Not anymore, Dave. You can buy pegs alone.
Well, can you? You didn't used
Yes.
to. Well, the solution to that, and it's a two benefit solution, is when you get down to the end of your leader, you tie this on, which is a swivel. And you can tie them in little ones or big ones. If I'm going to cast this a fair ways, I use a small swivel because a bigger swivel will tend to pinwheel a bit. And I tie the swivel on. And what the swivel is, it's big enough around that it won't go through the hole of the peg. So if you break a fish off the tippet, you're not going to lose your peg.
Question, Dave.
Yep.
When you're fishing, say you're fishing what, 10 feet down with the bobber, right?
Yeah.
Approximately. What if you're fishing in, because I assume the bloodworms are close to the bottom.
Yep.
So what if you're in like Prospect Lake and you're in 30 feet of water?
That makes it really hard.
Right. So you just guess, you drop it to the bottom and then just guess and don't use a buzzer. I mean, a bobber.
Well, you really need a long, I mean, that's what Phil and Brian were using. They were using very long, like 20 foot, 25 foot leaders. And the problem is, how the hell do you reel that into your rod if you've got a strike indicator on it? That's why they developed this peg that comes loose, so you can reel it right up to your rod to where you can manage the fish.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two things that this little swivel, well, three things actually, this little swivel does for you. One is that it keeps you from losing the peg if you break a fish off. The second thing is it adds a little bit of weight between the indicator and the swivel. And what that does is it takes out the wiggles in the leader that's going down from the indicator to the lure, the fly. And that makes it easier to detect strikes. Because if you've got all that slack in there, this bobber won't react until the fish is gone sometimes, particularly with a really long leader. And the other thing is, if you're fishing in Alberta and you're allowed to use two flies, you can attach one fly to the bottom like that, and you can attach another fly up from that off of the swivel. So that makes a really great two fly rig if you're allowed to fish with two flies. In BC, of course, you can't. But this swivel really helps in terms of taking the slack out of the leader. And that's the other thing is when you cast this guy out, and with a really long leader, you're probably not going to cast a 20-foot leader, a 25-foot leader. So you kind of cast it out and then you move the boat. And you use the strike indicator. Typically, the way I would set a strike indicator for lakes that are not 30 feet deep is I would attach a pair of forceps or one of these things which you get for ice fishermen. It's a little clamp with a weight on it. I attach that to the fly and I drop that down to the bottom, and then I'll pull it up about 1.5 feet to 2 feet, or a foot probably sometimes for the worms, and that's where I would set my strike indicator, so that the weight of the fly will take it down to the bottom and the strike indicator will float the fly about 1 foot to 18 inches off the bottom, because that's where the worms are going to be picked up by the fish. And it's the same thing is true with the pupa, which is the next fly. So this is what
Sorry,
people
Dave,
typically.
just before you continue.
Sure.
So the
Yep.
other thing that I've seen with Brian Chan and Phil Rowley and when they've done some of the fishing shows is they fish what they call naked. So they don't even use the bobber. And what they do is they have, especially when you're getting down 20, 25 feet or deeper, you just literally fishing over the side and you letting your leader, a long leader, go all the way down, and you fish with that as opposed to having a bobber.
Right.
And the longer you get with the leader and the further you have the bobber up the leader, the more difficult it is going to be to cast that thing.
That's correct. And what they do too with that, and here's the other thing that you need to think about when you're fishing chironomids, is even with a strike indicator, what you don't want is slack between the indicator or the fly, and your rod, because any of that slack, you will not see or feel the take. Fish pick up bugs like that. They don't bite them. What they do is they open their gills and they open their mouth at the same time, and that sucks the fly in. Now, if they feel that it's not a fly, they just close their gill plates and spit it out. They literally, they can get that fly out of there so fast you never see it or feel it. So the real trick is you either need to keep the slack between the indicator and the fly gone, so it's a straight line, or between your rod tip and the fly. You don't want any slack there. So the typical routine that I would use casting an indicator out, or as you say, fishing, what they call fishing naked, is once the fly is out there and down near the bottom or where you want to fish it, you pull in all your slack, you stick the rod tip of the rod into the water, and then you make slow inch long or very slow hand twist retrieve, so that you're always pulling the slack out of the leader between your fly line and the fly. And that way you will feel, or your rod tip will indicate the take, or the indicator will indicate the take, because sometimes it's really subtle.
When I first came across the Fishing Naked on Dale Freshie's show on YouTube, I sent him an email and I said, like, how far down do you strip down before you, like, is it totally naked or just with underwear on?
Yeah. So I will use this for fishing streams as well, right? We would fish nymphs on the bottom of the Red Deer River using the same rig, but with a much shorter leader. And if you do it right and keep the slack out of the line, you can see every little bump on the bottom. You can tell whether your fly is on the bottom or whether it's floating. So it's really important to keep that slack out. So the next stage is when these guys turn from worm to what we call pupa. They do this about 1.5 feet off the bottom to 2 feet off the bottom. And that's where they undergo the change from a larva to the pupa. And when that happens, they stage there for a while to make that metamorphosis. And when they get ready to hatch, they start retracting the worm part of their body up inside the nymph, and they leave a little piece at the end that is kind of the same color as the worm. That's why one of the guys in Edmonton that guides from time to time around town, he come up with this pattern. He calls it the Christmas Chironomid, because it's got a little red butt section before the actual larva body is. And then this is the wing case. This part up here is the wing case of the adult. And then there's the head. Now the reason for the bead on the head is literally to take that slack out and imitate the head of the upcoming pupa, where the wing case and all the legs are inside the pupal shuck. That we also tie mayfly nymphs this way because some of the same sort of thing happens. So when we do like a standard small mayfly nymph to fish in streams, I will tie a little red butt on the end, because I think the same sort of thing happens when they're going from larva to pupa. They just leave a little bit of end of that thing when they're making the transition that's a red color. And we found out that some of the nymphs we were using, if you put that little red tag on it, it increased the uptake by about 20%, I guess, off that rough idea. So this is what we're going to tie next. It's a midge pupa, and it's called a Christmas Chironomid because it's red and green. So for this guy, I use a curved nymph hook, and the Mustad 200R is the one that I like. It has a little bit of curve, but not a whole lot of curve. And I'll put this in the vise with the bead on. Now, I sized the bead to be a bit smaller than the size of the thorax that I think I'm going to tie on here. And the thorax for this thing is going to be Peacock Herl. I will put it in the vise so that the tip of the fly will be just slightly hanging down. And that helps keep the bead out of the way. And it gives me a little bit of access to the bend part of the hook, because I'm going to tie this body right down and around the bend. Drive it all around the bend. So the first thing I need is, for this one, is black thread, just black 8/0. And I will tie on right behind the bead. Now the bead, again, I've selected one that's about as big as I can get for this hook without it, the eye disappearing in the hole of the bead. Because I want the weight. I want the weight to take the slack out of the line. I want it to get down to the bottom. I'll start the thread right behind the bead. So the first thing I'm going to tie on here is the rib. And the rib, for me, this one is a fine gold wire. As they get bigger, you can increase the thickness of the wire, but I use a fairly, you can see it's almost whisker fine here, brass wire. And I will turn that off the spool. I don't use all those fancy little spool minders that Florin has. I'll take my wire and I will just stick the tip of it into the bead and back of the bead. And I'm using these beads that have, they're not slotted. They just have a bigger hole at the back than they have at the front. Whoop, that didn't hold. Let's try that again. I'm gonna get that on there. There we go. And I will wrap the thread. What I want to do with this, I want to keep the body fairly consistent. I don't want big lumps around it. So I'm going to wrap all the way down with my thread with fairly close wraps, coating the hook shank with the thread. I'll take it right down to and around the bend. That's why I have that thing just slightly pointed bead down, as it gives me a little better access right down to the bend of the hook. I'm going to bring my thread back up, covering up any parts of the shank that have been missed. Then I'll get my red floss or red tinsel, and this is holographic tinsel. This stuff happens to be pretty super fine tinsel. You can get it a little wider than this. This happens to be what I have on hand, because most of these midge pupa I'm tying are fairly small. So I'll take that holographic tinsel and I'll do the same thing. I will stick the tip of it where the bead is, make a wrap over, and I'll just pull it back a little bit so that it doesn't overlap the bead. Oh, and here's another trick for those who don't know. When you make a soft loop around, that loop will sometimes fall forward, and that makes it hard to trap a piece of material. So what I do is I let the bobbin hang and I spin it counterclockwise. What that does is it makes the loop fall back towards my fingers rather than the head of the fly. And what that means, I can capture that piece of material fairly easy. So what happens when you spin the bobbin like that, it either tightens or loosens the thread, and it causes that soft loop to fall either towards the front or the back, depending on which way you spin the bobbin. So you pull that right back to where the wire is. Bring my thread forward again, all the way up to the bead. And at this point, I take my hackle pliers to make this easier, and I will start wrapping this tinsel up the shank of the hook. And I'm going to, and the reason I use my Griffin hackle pliers is they swivel, which keeps the tinsel from twisting. It will go on flat. So, and I have these long handled ones. I use a long piece of tinsel so that I can avoid the bobbin every time I go around. And I'm going to wrap this all the way up. And that's what this does, two things. It again provides a little bit of a smoother underbody over the thread wraps for the next piece of tinsel, but it also helps build up a little bit the thickness of the body partway up the shank. When I get behind the eye, a couple of wraps behind, a couple of wraps in front, and then we'll trim that thing off. And the third thing is, this is my green flash. It's the same material. It's just green, shiny Christmas green color, holographic tinsel. So take a good piece of that. And I'll do the same thing. Again, I'll spin that bobbin counterclockwise and trap the tip of that green tinsel. I'm going to lay this on top and wrap my thread down. And I'm going to go all the way back here to where, almost where the hook point is, because I just want a little bit of red sticking out the bottom. So that's about right. And wrap my thread back up. And then I want to taper this, so I'm going to put some more thread wraps back about halfway forward, back again, not about a quarter of the way. And you can't really see it in this scale, but there is a little bit of a taper to this guy now. Grab my tinsel with the hackle pliers. This is where it's important having to take my Griffin tackle pliers and to put some heat shrink on the jaws so that it has a nice grip for the tinsel. And I'll wrap that up. Again, touching or even slightly overlapping. It's you don't want a lot of black showing through. So we'll get all the way up. Again, we get right behind the bead. Hold that up. So the thread through that little V shape. And then pull it back. Wrap in front. Trim it down. And now I'll take my wire, which is back here. Grab that with the hackle pliers as well. And I'll put relatively close wraps here with the wire. I'm gonna want about 6 or 8 wraps up here. There we go, I'll use my fingers. So I'll wrap a spiral rib up there, trying to make them nice and even. Again, get there, a couple of wraps behind, a couple of wraps in front. With this, I should be able to spin that so it comes undone. Maybe not. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Ah, broke off, good. Then the last thing I do is I'm going to take a piece of Peacock Herl, and I'll pull one that's reasonably long and fuzzy. I only need one because I don't need a whole whack of space. I'm going to reposition this hook just a bit. There we go. I'm going to start at the fuzzy tip, and again do that little spin. Capture my peacock curl. And I want to make this thorax about the same width as the bead, maybe a little more front to back. And I'll wrap my peacock curl in behind. And you'll see, I want to make sure that this is nice and fuzzy. And I want the thorax to be just a little thicker than the bead. So there we go. We're getting a nice thick part there. Come on, fuzz out. There we go. And then tie it out. Oh. Okay, let's try that again. Stuff happens. I broke my peacock curl. Let's get another one. It really helps if you have actually the entire peacock feather, because you can pick the really fuzzy ones out off the feather. These ones I have to kind of find one that's looks fairly fuzzy. There we go. Oh, come on. Ornery. Okay, there we go. This one wasn't quite as fuzzy as the last one. So I'll need a few more wraps to make it thick enough. There we go. Finally. Off. Grab my whip finisher. Yeah, we'll do a couple of whip finishes right behind the bead. And again, I'll do 2 so I don't have to lacquer this thing. Now I've used silver beads for some of them, and some of them I have black. So I'll show you the slightly different appearance of the guys with the black bead. So there's the one with the silver, and there's the one with the black. They really don't look a whole lot because that black bead's kind of shiny. It's slightly bigger too. But you can use either silver or black. I've seen some of them tied with glass beads too, but I like the tungsten because it gets them down where they can work pretty well. As an alternative to that, you can use this really fine colored tubing that you can get, and you can make the back and the thorax out of that rubber tubing. It's I forget what it's called. It's not larva lace. It's something like that. You can actually get one that's got one of those tubings that has oil in it, and you can tie it down, and it has a really translucent body effect. I have a little bit of an inventory of those, so that's an option for the Christmas chironomid. Of course,
So
there are a whole gazillion different kinds of those chironomid larvae you can tie.
yeah, so Dave, I think Phil Rowley in his book has a Christmas chironomid, which is actually alternating red and green.
Oh, yeah.
So he puts a base down of red or green and then alternates and has like a tinsel width of space between each wrap so that you get the color coming through. I'd have to check the book again. It's packed away right now.
The one that I first saw was developed by a guy in Edmonton called whose name is Mike Monteith, and Mike runs a part-time guiding business in Edmonton. And
Okay.
he calls himself Doc. And I've been out with Doc, not chironomid fishing. I did one of the silent auction things for the Trout Unlimited guys one year. I picked up a day's fishing with Doc, and we went out and we were fishing back swimmers and water boatmen and fishing them on a washing line. And boy, did we have a good time.
Mhm.
We don't use the washing line method out here because they don't let you. But in Alberta, fishing a washing line is really, really effective. Maybe that's why they don't let us do it here. And for those who aren't familiar, washing line is where you have a floating fly at the end and you have 2 or 3 flies on a rig between there and the end of your fly line. And they tend to sag a little bit. So you tie a floater here and a slightly sinker here and another one here. So you have 2 or 3 flies on the line and you do a really slow troll or a slow retrieve, and it's very effective. The Brits use that a lot on their drift fishing. Okay, so
Dave, maybe I should do, before you do your adult, maybe I should do the subsurface stuff.
That's a good idea. I'll just give you a quick once over what's going to come next is the emerger. It's not the adult, it's the emerger. And you can see as I've been going, these flies have been getting smaller, right? So the hook sizes are getting smaller. And this is a curved shrimp hook. It's actually, I have a stock of old partridge ones that I really like for this. And the adult is going to look like that. So you go ahead and do your next little section, which would be the chironomid and your indicator thing. So you're up. You're gonna spotlight yourself.
No, I'm just sharing the screen.
Okay, I'm just gonna de-spotlight me for the moment. There you go.
So here's, we had a little conversation. What's a shank? And to me, articulated can only be when you have 2 or more of these things. But this is what the label says. And they come in different lengths. The shortest I found was this 15 millimeter one, and they go up to 25 millimeters. And I found, kind of in terms of looks and things, this is probably the most useful one. And I've actually did some field testing, and it works. So the idea is simply to get around this difficulty of fishing in places where you're not allowed to tie 2 flies on your line. And that's all of British Columbia and running water, as far as I understand. And it's also the national parks. So if you like to fish in the national parks, again, you're restricted to a single fly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to substitute for that fly, which I tie in for weighting purposes only. It usually doesn't catch fish. So it's, in years of fishing 2 flies on a line, I've only caught maybe once 2 fish. So it's, if that's the justification for forbidding that kind of a rig, I think the reasoning behind it is rather flimsy. Anyway, so what I'm doing is I'm combining the shank with a little swivel, and this is sold as a size. I'm looking for my package here. It says size 10, whatever. So this is, I thought, a size of swivel that's appropriate to this size of shank. And I just get some thread. So the rest of the concoction is actually fairly straightforward. So I'm just taking some thread, I'm attaching the thread, and then the thing I want to do is I want to close this gap here on the wire with my thread. So go here and then close the gap. And then I'm going to add a little bit of wire. Again, depending on jurisdiction, you may want to use lead or not. This is lead-free wire, and I use 0.25. So The idea with wire is usually you try to match the thickness of whatever you're wrapping on, or go a little thinner. So what I'm going to do is, and now again, to put things in the order I'm going to do them. So first I'm going to tie in this Fritz stuff, which is like a fatter, denser crystal chenille in my mind. That's essentially what it is, but it's rather flashier almost than your standard crystal chenille. So tie this back here so it hangs on the back of your vise. I don't have this spool, so it's a little bit harder to it's a little bit harder to handle. Then bring the thread forward and attach the wire. And the main reason I've tied that chenille first on is because the cut edge where that open loop is on the shank, that can be a little sharp, and you cut the thread and then it's no fun. So move the thread forward and then just wrap wire going forward in nice tight turns. If you want more weight, if you think that this is not heavy enough, and I actually weighed this concoction when finished, and I compared it to some of my standard weighed flies, and it's about the same weight as a size 10 or 12 weighted nymph that has a bead and then some weighting wire behind the bead. And so I thought, yeah, okay, this is appropriate. So the weight comes in around 0.5 gram plus or minus, 5%, I'd say. So within plus or minus 5% of 5 grams. And then if you want to wrap this very nicely, it's actually better if you have a rotary vise to take advantage of a rotary vise. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hang my thread here and then wrap this. And again, what I'm trying to do with this is I'm going to treat it the same way you would treat a wet fly hackle, meaning I'm going to this is already kind of folded nicely on the core, and I'm just going to tighten the tension a little bit on the vise so it's easier to do the wrapping so it doesn't swing around, and just pull back on these fibers as I'm wrapping to try to get as tidy of a mess that I can get here. But this material is used, my understanding is it's used to tie these things called blobs.
Yes.
And they're tied on hooks, right? But basically this is a hookless blob or a swivel blob or whatever you want to call it. Okay, so just do this. And then as you can see, here's my blob. It's nice and tight. The fibers are pointing back, which is what I'm aiming for. And I'm going to lock the vise here and get my thread back and secure the Fritz. There you go. Use my rough scissors for this, as I'm not sure how nasty this core is on my fine scissors. And then just pull the remaining fibers here back. This is not the friendliest material to work with, but there we go. So here, a good few wraps of thread. You want this to be well secured. And the other thing is that these front loops are not always quite perfectly closed. So make sure you put enough thread here to close that off so things don't slip off. Okay. And then I'm not going to come with any sort of head cement near something this fuzzy. So 2 finishes will do the trick. And I fished one of these things for several days without anything really coming apart. So it's not a problem. Okay, now how do you fish this thing? I guess it's pretty obvious. What you're gonna do is you take this guy and you attach it to your leader, basically like this, right? So you attach the leader here, and then you attach a piece of tippet to the swivel. And then to that tippet, you attach your fly. Apparently, Phil Rowley was doing a demonstration a couple of days ago where he was tying a blob and then on a hook, and then a piece of tippet on the hook bend, and then a nymph underneath, and he would fish that on a lake. Obviously, you can do the same thing with this swivel blob. So that seems to be an idea that's out there, and it's been used. I can report having had success fishing these blobs. I'm not going to tell you where because this is recorded. We can talk about that later. And yeah, well, you know, I am mindful of the fact that this is recorded. So what you see here is only the partial truth. I'm not giving off all the secrets.
Lauren, so how far back from the attractor blob do you typically put your fly?
12 to 15 inches.
Oh, okay, so fairly short.
Fairly short. I fished this thing exactly the same way I would fish a 2-nymph rig.
Okay.
It's the exact same setup. The only thing is I'm trying to work around this restriction of not being able to use a hook.
Two flies, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and another alternative to the one I just showed you is to use chenille instead of the blob material. So this is
yes. Okay.
This is a vile fluorescent pink chenille.
Yeah.
And the reason you would want to use that is I'll show you what these things look like. So here's a bunch of these blobs. And if you tie it with chenille, it looks like this. And I think what happens is, you know, if you're fishing in a lake, it doesn't matter. I don't think there's any difference. But if you're trying to fish this in a stream, I think the difference is your whole setup, you know, this blob and your fly are being carried by the current, and the blob puts more resistance in the water, so it sinks slower. So if you're fishing very slow water, again, it doesn't matter. But if you're fishing a little faster water, you want maybe a little bit more weight. So you do this on a longer shank and you put chenille instead of this fuzzy stuff, because the chenille is much tighter on the shank and it wouldn't put as much resistance, you know, when it sinks, right? But if you fish slow stretches, and this is where this rig I think comes in nicely, because if you're fishing a slow stretch, you know, the usually people think of midges as a lake fishing thing, and the midges, they're bigger and everything. But if you fish streams, and if you have slow stretches of stream with silt bottoms, you will also find midges there. And if you like to fish the off season, so to speak, you will find that midges are a valuable thing in your fly box. Yeah. But of course, the challenge is the stream midges are going to be small. I'm tying this on a gigantic size 14 hook. And here's I've been a very good customer of Trout Bum recently. This is where my hooks come from. I really like the shape of these hooks. So this is what I'm using. These Chironomid heavy wire hooks. They're also nice
Okay.
because they have a slightly upturned point.
Good thing I introduced you to trout bone there.
Oh, Dave, you've created a monster there. But thank you. That was a good recommendation. I really appreciate it.
Sorry,
And then
Sean, just getting back to your previous tie. Do you use a weighted fly typically with that rig, or do you not weight it since you've got weight on the articulated?
Well, I normally weigh my my Chironomids. I put a this one takes a 3/32 tungsten bead on.
Okay.
But the thing is, I tie these things down to size 18 curved hooks, which is
Okay.
almost like a size 20 Chironomid. And I find that every little bit of weight helps.
Okay.
And
Thank
it
you.
doesn't impede the motion, but you can get away with this thing putting an unweighted fly if you're concerned that a weighted fly would be impeded in its motion in the stream, right? So if I were to fish, let's say, a size 12 stonefly below this thing, I wouldn't bother weighting that. Or if I put a bead on it, I would put a brass bead instead of tungsten, right? So I'd go 1/8 of an inch bead on a size 12, like a 200R hook, similar to what Dave was using earlier. I would go brass rather than tungsten because tungsten would be way too heavy. So anyway, this is a quick and easy tie. So just a little bit of 8/0 thread and start behind the bead. Then I'm going to use some of this, and I think I'm going to look for some more because I really like tying with this wire. This is this flat wire in medium, which for a size 14 hook is big enough, or I should say small enough. So always tie the wire on first, so you get this nice smooth underbody, and tie it on for the whole length of the hook. Okay, no skimping here because then you get ugly bumps on the hook if you don't do that. And also I think it helps if I flatten my thread a little bit.
That's spinning it clockwise, not counterclockwise. That's
Well, from where I'm looking from above, it's spinning counterclockwise. Depending, I'm wary of giving those indications because it's always a matter of which way you're looking at the whole thing from. And then to put the rib on, I actually like to use the rotary vise because it gives me a safe way to do this evenly, and I don't have to worry about anything. And so I just take the wire and wrap away. And it's easy to get carried away and tie dozens of these beasts. Okay, so there we go. Swing that out of the way. And helicopter the wire.
This looks too complex. It's like 33% more material than the bloodworm.
Well, it's a very effective fly. It's actually an easy tie compared to a lot of things. And it doesn't look like a worm. So if you have an aversion to fishing things that look like worms, then that's the way to go. There are a few more steps though, Mohammed. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but but wait, there is more, So what I like to do now is I like to do a little bit of a hot spot right behind the bead. And this works. It's a lot easier to tie these things smaller, but for demonstration purposes, I thought, size 14 is probably a little better, right? Because you're using fine thread, And heck, I can also use my rotating feature here. You want to make sure that the gap behind the bead is nicely filled. That's the main concern you're having here. Okay, and then this is a bit of a surprisingly fragile spot. So this is almost like one of those ice cream cones with a vile pink flavor. And there's a final step. What I like to do on these things is take the darn thing and have it meet a coat of Sally Hansen's and let it dry. So, you know, you tie a dozen of these things, you put them on your electronics clips, give them a coat of Sally Hansen's, let them dry. And that sort of gives you a nicer looking body, and it increases. There are two failure points for this fly. You know, you can fish one of these flies for a whole day and catch a whole whack of fish. And it's an easy tie, so, you know, no big deal. But the wire sometimes gets loose here, no matter how tight you wind it on. And the coat of Sally Hansen's helps with that. And the other thing is that this hotspot thread may start fraying a little bit. And I don't like that. So then again, this coat of lacquer would help. And that's that. And I like to fish this particular combo. I find to be a rather effective one. And that's why I wanted to show you this particular concoction. So this lets you fish small, even unweighted flies, deep down in a current, and with good results. And I am done.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Florin.
So
Okay.
you guys give it a try. You can. I'm sure this works in a lake too.
Yeah,
I don't know what
will.
the rules are. Can you fish 2 flies in a lake?
No,
No.
No.
No. Okay. Well then, I think it's worth a try. And I also tied them in some. I have some chartreuse frits, but
Yeah, you might have trouble using that rig on the fly fishing only section of the caution because it has some specific rules about strike indicators, and that might be considered a strike indicator.
it's not, because it's invisible. It's all the way deep down in the water. Sorry. They'll have to update the rules.
Yeah. All right.
And we'll keep coming up with solutions.
Now, the next one I'm going to do is the emerger, which happens when that nymph gets to the surface. It leaves a trailing shuck behind. It leaves a little bit of the thorax behind, but the fly is actually crawling out of the shuck and ready to emerge. And in some chironomids that happens just like that, and in others it takes a little while. So this is basically not quite the adult stage. What I've given you in the email was the body is black thread with a black thread rib, but I'm going to tie one for you today in green with a black rib so that you can see the rib a little better. The thread body is thread. It's basically the trailing shuck of the nymph. The thorax is just a little bit of dubbing, and I've used squirrel dubbing to represent the remaining part of the wing case and the fly crown out. And all this part here, which is the emerging adult, is CDC, otherwise known as cul de canard, or in English, duck butt. The advantage of duck butt is that these feathers come off of the duck near the oil gland at the back and the ducks use that oil to oil up their feathers so that ducks don't sink, they float. So if you get a natural CDC, it will not have been dyed and stripped of its oil. So this sucker will actually float pretty well. I'm going to tie it with green thread. You can use different colors of CDC. This is a much blonder CDC. And one of the problems with the natural CDC is they're hard to see. So you could always use something like that that's orange. So you can piddle around with the colors of the CDC feather. It's, again, a fairly simple tie. The hook is that I'm using, like I say, I have an inventory of these partridge hooks, but it's basically a barbless shrimp hook. This partridge is a size 18, but in actual fact, it's more like a size 16 curved shrimp hook. So I've got 8/0 green thread. Oh, I knew that was going to happen. I'm going to have to reload my bobbin. The thread came out. By the way, for those of you who don't have a bobbin threader, this is actually a thing that you use for threading dental floss through your teeth. You can buy a little box of these things for next to nothing at the drugstore. And you put that in the eye, and oh, there you go, threaded your bobbin. Okay, so this is actually 6/0 orange, so it makes the body a little easier to see. Tied on right behind the eye. And I'm going to wrap back to where the thorax would normally be over top before I trim off the excess of thread. Now from here, I'm going to wrap all the way down the hook shank with this green thread, and I want to completely cover the thread with the hook with thread. And once again, I'm going to wrap this thing all the way down and around the bend, right to the very back. This trailing shuck hangs down below the emerging adult. And it's just a skinny little bit of stuff that is left sticking in below the surface film. The whole idea is that the dubbing and the CDC will sit on top of or in the surface film, and this stuff will actually extend below the surface film a little bit. Now, at this point, I'm going to take a little piece of black thread, and this is 3/0. And I will do a quick wrap around that. And then I'm going to suck it back so that I don't have to trim it. And wrap over that. Right around the corner. To back where the green thread is. Then I'll wrap forward with my green thread. All the way up the shank of the hook. And again, I can do that thing that I did before, which is give this a little bit of a taper by wrapping back with my green thread and then wrapping forward again a bit. So I have a little bit of a tapered shape to that thread body. Then I'm going to take my black thread here, take my Griffith hackle plier, and because this is a thicker thread, what I'm going to do with it is I'm going to spin it clockwise like crazy here. So you can see I'm spinning the daylights out of it. Because I don't want this to be flat. I want it to be a round thread when I wrap forward. And I will wrap around, make a spiral wrap up for a rib. And every time I do that, I'm going to give it another clockwise twist. A couple of twists every time. And you can see the ribbing in that. That's why I'm doing it in green, is so you can see the contrast between the rib and the background a little better. I hope you can see that. So when I get it right up to the position where the wing is going to go, I'll tie it off. Trim. Again, for beginners, I always trim off on the top so that I don't cut my tying thread and have the bobbin end up on the floor. Okay, now this is where I'm going to put my CDC, and I'm going to start a little more than an eye width behind the eye. I'm going to leave my thread hang there. I'm going to find my CDC feathers that I need for this. What I'm looking for is a CDC feather that has fairly long fibers near the tip. And I'm only going to use the little bit at the end. So I'm going to fold these back, and I want my wing to be probably a little, about the same shank length as the hook, give or take a bit. Probably a little longer doesn't hurt, but, and I'm going to I will strip back the CDC towards the butt, away from the shank of the hook. So now I have a bare shank there of the feather. I'm going to lay that down right on top of the hook shank with the feather curving up. See how it curves up a little bit? Yeah. I need to get some more CDC off the shank of the feather, shaft of the feather. There you go. So that there's a bit of a curve to that, and I want the curve to be going upward. I'm going to do one spin to get the loop to fall right. I'm going to make 1, 2 wraps over top of the hook shank and just let it sit there. I will pull up on both ends so that it's sitting on top of the hook shank. And I'll find another one. It's about the same. It's going to have fairly long fibers at the tip, and I will strip that back from the quill of the feather. Same thing, about the same length as the last one, to expose the quill. And once again, I'll lay it down so the curve is facing up. The shaft of the feather, and do again 1, 2 light wraps, holding it in place. And the reason for doing several is that it gives some bulk to the tip of the fly, to the wing of the fly. So again, here's another one. I measure it roughly the same length. Strip it back from the quill. Lay it down on the shank, and a couple of light wraps. Then what we do is we wiggle them around in those light wraps so that all the shafts of the CDC are sitting on top of the hook. I will grab all of the tag end of those together, and I will pull them gently backwards on the hook shank to mash them all together and shorten them up till they're the wing's length that I want when it's pointing straight up. At that point, I will do a couple of snug wraps behind them, pull up the front tip, and do a couple of good wraps in front to make them stand up. Bring my thread behind again. And I will lift up the CDC butts, sneak my scissors in there, and trim them off. Oh, gotta get, it's a little bit tight here. Trim them off right there. So that's got the CDC feathers attached. I'll throw the last, by the way, this is, if you can find a bag like this of CDCs, you're doing real well. They can tend to be a little bit on the pricey side if you can't find them in bulk. Get a couple more wraps in front just to make sure that that wing is kind of standing up. Then I'll take my Thorax, and I've got some squirrel blend here. I'm going to use a olive squirrel blend and just a teeny bit of dubbing that I'm going to wrap around the thread, spin around the thread. And that's about all I need, just a teeny bit, maybe an inch worth of it on the hook shank. And I can see there's some sticking out here I need to trim off. Tidy it up a bit. When I get it wrapped on, there's a nice tight little rope, then I'll slide it right up to the thorax. I'm going to make that thorax mostly in behind where the wing is. And then I'm going to make just a little bit of a wrap in front to help stand the wing up. And get my whip finisher. Hold them out of the way. And once more, hold them out of the way. 3. Trim it off. And I can see this little bit of stuff sticking out to the sides here. I'm just going to trim it up a bit. I don't know what that is. There we go. And there's your little CDC emerger.
Very nice, Dave.
So it's not that difficult to fly to tie. It's a little tricky if you're doing it all in black because you can't see that rib. But you could use different colors for the body and just use the black 3/0 for the rib. It's a very delicate looking fly, and like I say, this would be the equivalent of a size 16. You could probably tie that down to a size 18. I don't know if I'd want to go. A lot of midges are quite small, but man, that'd be tough to tie a size 20, I tell you. And that'll sit right in the surface film with this sticking up, so you can actually see it.
And you don't oil that wing. You just shake the water out of it.
It's natural CDC, so it already has the oil in it. Now the dyed ones, the ones that are different colors than the natural, you might want to oil those, but you need the CDC oil. And I was fortunate enough when Mark Petitjean was visiting us way back when. I bought some really nice CDC from him, and I bought a little vial of CDC oil that I have in my vest that I could put a tiny dab of CDC on that feather. But you're right, if you've got the natural ones, they have the oil built in, and they will float like a cork without having to just blow them dry.
Okay.
So they will float right in the surface film with this little wing sticking up. And again, the difficulty with fishing this is seeing it.
Well, I mean, you can always substitute some synthetic if you don't have the CDC, and those are usually,
Yeah.
quite visible.
Yeah, some synthetic, a very light synthetic. You don't want anything that's got any bulk to it for the wing. Otherwise, what'll happen is it'll flop over. Whereas the CDC ones, when these hit the water, they will sit with that wing straight up in the air.
Yeah.
And that's it for this. So I'll stop the recording.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Dave.
Thanks, both of you.
Thank you.
I need to get